Madrid, 1834. You're the royal physician, and your hands are shaking. The king is dead, but your most horrifying task is just beginning. Queen Maria Cristina stands before you with a request so twisted, so unthinkable that you question your own sanity. What lies beneath those silk sheets isn't just a corpse. It's the grotesque secret that terrorized Spain for 2 decades. Ferdinand VII. Even in death. The man who destroyed 3 wives and countless lives seems to laugh at you, but it's not his face that draws your horrified attention. It's what lies hidden beneath those royal sheets. The anatomical monstrosity that would make grown physicians weep. What you're about to discover is the physical embodiment of Spain's most cursed bloodline. An anatomical horror so disturbing that the Vatican sealed it away for eternity. This is the true story of a king whose intimate monstrosity became a national catastrophe. Ferdinand was born cursed, not by witchcraft, but by centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs had spent generations marrying cousins to cousins, creating a genetic nightmare that would manifest in the most intimate and horrifying way possible. By his teenage years, it became clear that nature had played the cruelest joke imaginable. Ferdinand's member began developing in ways that defied medical understanding, growing into something that seemed almost alien in its proportions. Contemporary medical records, hidden in Vatican archives for centuries, describe Ferdinand's endowment in terms that convey pure horror. One physician wrote, "His member resembles a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." The court buzzed with whispers. Servants giggled behind their hands. Foreign diplomats reported back about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand learned early that his most intimate self was a source of amusement, and this humiliation bred a festering resentment that would consume Spain itself. The shame was turning him into a monster. When a young page accidentally saw Ferdinand changing, the prince didn't just dismiss him, he had the boy flogged and his family exiled. The message was clear: no one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished. Royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what they euphemistically called marital aids. The workshop resembled a combination of medical laboratory and torture chamber, creating devices that would allow Ferdinand to function sexually without killing his future wives. Before we dive deeper into this royal nightmare, smash that like button and subscribe to Nightmare Historians for more dark historical secrets they don't want you to know. And comment below, where in the world are you watching from? Let's explore these forbidden histories together. In 1802, Ferdinand's first victim arrived. Princess Maria Antonia of Naples. Young, beautiful, innocent, she had heard Ferdinand called the Desired One and imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. She had no idea she was walking into a living nightmare. The wedding night destroyed her mind instantly. Maria Antonia's first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into hysterics. She screamed, "Monster, monster!" until her ladies feared she'd lost her reason. What followed was less a romantic union than a medieval torture session. Ferdinand's specially trained physicians had to be called in like surgeons. The custom cushions were arranged, oils applied, and what followed resembled a medical procedure more than lovemaking. Maria Antonia required laudanum just to endure what marriage had become. The psychological trauma was complete. Maria Antonia developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD, becoming addicted to laudanum to escape the horror of her marital duties. She became a walking ghost, haunting the halls of her own palace prison. Ferdinand's desperation reached insane heights. He consulted mystics who convinced him his deformed member was actually a dragon's rod, a divine blessing requiring special rituals. For 3 months, he subjected himself and his dying wife to bizarre ceremonies that only increased her trauma. Twice, miraculously, Maria Antonia became pregnant, and twice her traumatized body rejected the pregnancies. The first miscarriage came at 4 months, the second nearly killed her at full term. Her body simply couldn't sustain a child conceived through such violence. Ferdinand's response revealed his true evil. Instead of showing compassion, he accused Maria Antonia of deliberately causing the miscarriages. He convinced himself she was sabotaging their chances of an heir, adding psychological torture to her already unbearable physical suffering. In 1807, Maria Antonia found her only escape, death. She was just 21 years old, destroyed by years of sexual trauma and psychological abuse. Her final words were reportedly a prayer of gratitude for her approaching liberation from Ferdinand's monstrous marriage. Ferdinand's grief was as twisted as his anatomy. He insisted on viewing Maria Antonia's body multiple times, touching her corpse and commissioning a death mask. Visitors reported seeing him conducting conversations with his dead wife's face, displayed like a trophy in his chambers. Before Maria Antonia was even buried, Ferdinand was already negotiating for his next victim. The challenge now was finding a European princess willing to marry a king, whose wives met such grim fates and whose personal peculiarities were becoming legendary across the continent. The negotiations proved nearly impossible. Several potential brides withdrew after private consultations with physicians who had served at the Spanish court. Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction had become a diplomatic liability that threatened to isolate Spain from all potential allies. Eventually, they found another lamb for slaughter. Maria Isabel of Portugal, just 19 years old, arrived in Madrid in 1816. Like her predecessor, she carried the same naive hope that royal brides, brought to these arranged murders, disguised as marriages. The second wedding night was an even greater disaster. Despite all Ferdinand's new devices and expert consultations, his anatomical monstrosity proved as insurmountable as ever. The screams that echoed through the palace were not passion, but genuine terror and agony. Maria Isabel never recovered from that first night. She developed a pronounced stutter, flinched whenever Ferdinand appeared, and suffered nightmares, where she screamed warnings about the monster that haunted her sleep. Another innocent mind shattered by Ferdinand's curse. Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction had metastasized into political psychosis. He interpreted Maria Isabel's obvious terror as a personal insult to his royal dignity. His paranoia reached new heights as he convinced himself she was conspiring with foreign powers to mock his condition. The bedroom failures were becoming state policy. The king's sexual inadequacy transformed into a surveillance state. Maria Isabel's correspondence was intercepted, her food tested for poison, her chambers searched for evidence of treason. Ferdinand's intimate failures had infected every aspect of his rule, turning royal marriage into espionage warfare. The desperation reached grotesque new levels. Ferdinand invited foreign experts to witness his intimate failures, turning his marriage bed into a medical theater. German anatomists and French physicians took detailed notes, making Ferdinand's sexual dysfunction a subject of academic study across Europe. Maria Isabel's mind finally snapped completely. She stopped eating, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and developed the 1,000-yard stare that servants found more terrifying than her earlier outbursts. The young queen had become a living corpse, haunting her own palace prison. Spain's American colonies, already in revolt, seized on Ferdinand's intimate shame as political ammunition. Revolutionary propaganda depicted him as a sexually impotent tyrant whose physical inadequacies mirrored his political incompetence. The king's most private shame had become a rallying cry for independence. From Mexico to Argentina, Ferdinand's response was characteristically brutal. He restored the Inquisition to investigate sexual slander against the crown, creating a climate of terror where even private conversations between married couples could result in imprisonment or death. His intimate shame had weaponized religious persecution. The king's obsession with secrecy reached absurd proportions. He ordered hidden passages throughout the palace, installed mirrors at strategic angles to detect eavesdroppers, and employed armies of spies whose only job was monitoring gossip about his royal marriage. The palace became a monument to sexual paranoia. In her broken mental state, Maria Isabel began experiencing phantom pregnancies, periods where she exhibited signs of carrying a child despite the biological impossibility. These episodes gave Ferdinand brief moments of hope, followed by crushing disappointment when reality reasserted itself. Even her delusions became his torture. In 1818, Maria Isabel found her escape the same way as her predecessor, through death. She was just 21, destroyed by 2 years of sexual trauma and psychological terror. But even in death, she couldn't escape Ferdinand's twisted mind. He immediately suspected murder. Unable to recognize his own role in her destruction, Ferdinand ordered multiple autopsies, searched for evidence of poison, and arrested several of Maria Isabel's ladies-in-waiting on suspicion of conspiracy. His grief was indistinguishable from his paranoia, creating a feedback loop of rage and suspicion that consumed everyone around him. By 1819, they found their third victim. Maria Joseph Amalia of Saxony was 24, older and more worldly than her predecessors, but she carried the same doomed hope. Her family's desperate financial situation made them willing to overlook Ferdinand's reputation as a wife killer. Maria Joseph had been better prepared for her ordeal, bringing her own collection of medical devices and a personal physician, specializing in difficult marital situations. Her approach was clinical rather than romantic, treating her royal duties as a medical problem to be solved. Through scientific methodology, the third marriage settled into a pattern of scheduled medical procedures. Maria Joseph kept detailed records of their encounters, noting times, techniques, and outcomes with the precision of a research scientist. Romance had been completely replaced by clinical methodology. Ferdinand's paranoia expanded further. He suspected Maria Joseph viewed him as a medical curiosity rather than a husband, and began believing she was secretly documenting his condition for Saxon intelligence services. Even scientific understanding of his dysfunction became evidence of international conspiracy. While Ferdinand battled his own anatomy, Spain crumbled around him. The American colonies achieved independence one by one, taking the wealth that had sustained the empire for centuries. Cabinet meetings were postponed when Ferdinand was having difficult periods with his wife, leaving crucial decisions unmade for weeks. The Spanish people, initially grateful for Ferdinand's return from exile, began understanding the true cost of their restored monarch. Revolutions simmered in the cities while bandits controlled the countryside. The king's subjects starved, while he spent fortunes on sexual aids and foreign medical consultants. Then in 1829, the impossible happened. After 10 years of clinical matrimony, Maria Joseph became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through the Spanish court and across Europe, where diplomatic correspondence buzzed with speculation about how Ferdinand had finally overcome his anatomical obstacles. Ferdinand's reaction was a mixture of euphoria and terror. He hired additional guards to protect Maria Joseph, brought in the finest physicians from across Europe, and had her chambers blessed by every religious authority in Madrid. His desperation to protect this miraculous pregnancy bordered on complete madness. The pregnancy progressed normally until the 7th month, when Maria Joseph began experiencing complications that palace physicians struggled to understand. Ferdinand's interference with her medical treatment, his insistence on consulting mystics alongside trained physicians, created chaos that made effective intervention impossible. On May 18, 1829, Maria Joseph went into premature labor. The delivery was a horror that traumatized everyone present, as Ferdinand insisted on personally supervising the proceedings, despite having no medical knowledge whatsoever. His interference turned a medical emergency into a royal catastrophe. The baby, a daughter, lived for only a few hours before succumbing to the complications of premature birth. Maria Joseph survived the delivery but never recovered her strength, dying 3 weeks later from what physicians termed childbed fever, but which was more likely infection and despair. Ferdinand's reaction revealed the complete breakdown of his sanity. He refused to allow either body to be buried, insisting that court physicians continue attempting to revive both mother and child through increasingly bizarre means. For nearly a week, the palace filled with the stench of decay. When Ferdinand finally accepted that his wife and daughter were dead, he fell into a depression so profound that courtiers feared for his life. He stopped eating, refused to see advisors, and spent his days staring at the death masks of all three of his wives. The king had become a living ghost, but fate had one final cruel joke to play. In 1829, at age 45, Ferdinand's advisors had identified Maria Cristina of Naples as a potential fourth wife. What they didn't tell Ferdinand until after the marriage, negotiations were complete, was that Maria Cristina was already pregnant by another man when she arrived in Madrid. The fourth wedding was a farcical spectacle that fooled absolutely no one. Maria Cristina was visibly pregnant when she walked down the aisle, carrying a child that could not possibly be Ferdinand's. Yet the king, so desperate for an heir, willingly accepted this obvious deception, convinced that divine providence had finally answered his prayers. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have marked triumph, but instead became the source of new torment. Ferdinand knew the child wasn't biologically his, yet he had to maintain the fiction of legitimacy to preserve his dynasty. His greatest political success, securing the succession, was simultaneously his most profound personal failure. His relationship with Maria Cristina became a masterpiece of mutual deception. She pretended to respect him while he pretended to believe her child was his own blood. Their entire marriage was an elaborate performance, each partner playing a role in a drama that everyone knew was completely false. Ferdinand continued his desperate attempts to produce a child that would actually be his own blood. The same parade of physicians and specialists who had observed his previous failures witnessed even more. Pathetic efforts as his advancing age made success increasingly impossible. The anatomical horror hadn't diminished. It had only become more grotesque. Ferdinand's final years were consumed by surveillance paranoia that shocked even cynical courtiers. He conducted random midnight raids on Maria Cristina's chambers, bursting through doors with armed guards to catch her in imagined acts of treason. These terrifying episodes left the Queen's ladies in waiting, afraid to sleep. His obsession reached grotesque new depths. Ferdinand had peepholes drilled into the walls between his chambers and Maria Cristina's, spending hours watching her through these crude spy holes like some demented voyeur. Palace servants reported seeing the king's eye pressed against these openings during his wife's most private moments. The food tasting rituals became elaborate, ceremonies of suspicion that could delay meals for hours. Ferdinand insisted tasters wait 30 minutes between sampling and serving to ensure any slow-acting poisons would take effect. He watched these unfortunate servants with the intensity of a predator, searching for any sign of contamination. Maria Cristina, trapped in this web of suspicion, began showing signs of the same psychological deterioration that had claimed Ferdinand's previous wives. Her intercepted letters to family in Naples revealed a woman slowly losing her grip on sanity, describing her life as existing in a glass cage where every breath is monitored for signs of rebellion. Ferdinand's relationship with infant Isabella became another source of pathological anxiety. Despite knowing she wasn't his biological child, he simultaneously loved her as his heir and resented her as evidence of his sexual failure. He spent hours studying her features, commissioning portraits to compare with paintings of himself and Maria Cristina's suspected lovers. The king consulted genealogists and physiognomists, hoping to find scientific proof of Isabella's legitimacy that would quiet his doubts. These experts, well aware of the dangerous nature of their task, provided carefully ambiguous opinions that could be interpreted to support whatever conclusion Ferdinand preferred. Ferdinand's efforts to control his wife's behavior became increasingly invasive. He assigned specific servants to monitor Maria Cristina's correspondence, requiring them to report not only the content of her letters, but her facial expressions while writing them. The royal marriage had become an intelligence operation. Maria Christina's personal diary, discovered centuries later hidden behind a false wall, reveals the toll this surveillance took on her mental health. She wrote of feeling like an actress who must never break character, not even in my dreams. The performance of being Ferdinand's wife had consumed her entire existence. The international implications of Ferdinand's paranoia began affecting Spain's diplomatic relationships. Foreign ambassadors reported back about the king's erratic behavior and the instability of his court. Marriage negotiations for European alliances stalled as potential partners questioned whether Spain could honor long-term commitments under such unpredictable leadership. The economic cost of Ferdinand's paranoia was staggering. The crown spent enormous sums on security measures, spy networks, and loyalty investigations, while Spain's treasury emptied and its people suffered. Resources that might have addressed the mounting financial crisis were instead consumed by the king's sexual insecurity. Ferdinand's health began deteriorating under the constant stress of maintaining his surveillance state. Palace physicians noted chronic insomnia, digestive problems, and what they termed nervous agitation. His paranoia had created a feedback loop where his fears generated behaviors that justified even more. The king's bedroom became a grotesque museum of his sexual failures, filled with portraits of his dead wives, medical devices that had failed to solve his anatomical problems, and religious relics he hoped might provide divine intervention. Ferdinand conducted state audiences from this space, surrounded by reminders of his most intimate disasters. Ferdinand's paranoia reached its bizarre culmination in 1832 when he became convinced that Maria Christina was attempting to poison him through intimate contact. He began demanding that his wife submit to medical examinations before any physical interaction, searching for evidence of toxins that might be transmitted through skin contact. The international community watched Spain's descent into madness with mixture of fascination and horror. Diplomatic correspondence reveals that European powers were actively planning for the eventual collapse of Ferdinand's government, with some nations secretly supporting regional independence movements within Spain. As 1833 dawned, Ferdinand's physical health finally began reflecting the psychological damage of his paranoid reign. Court physicians noted persistent tremors, chronic digestive problems, and what appeared to be early signs of cognitive decline. His speeches became rambling affairs filled with accusations against unnamed enemies. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic after decades of dramatic dysfunction. Ferdinand simply began fading away, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated stress of a lifetime spent battling his own anatomy and psychology. In his final days, he drifted between consciousness and delirium, sometimes calling out to his dead wives. The official cause was listed as gout, but palace physicians privately acknowledged that Ferdinand had essentially died of exhaustion, physical, psychological, and spiritual exhaustion brought on by decades of sexual frustration and political paranoia that had consumed his entire existence. The autopsy of Ferdinand VII, conducted in secret by the same physicians who had spent years trying to solve his anatomical puzzles, revealed the full extent of nature's cruel joke. What they discovered in that royal death chamber would shock even men who had witnessed decades of medical horror. The king's member, preserved for medical study, measured an astounding 14 inches in length and varied dramatically in girth from base to tip, exactly as contemporary descriptions had suggested. But the autopsy revealed something even more disturbing than the grotesque size. Evidence of deliberate self-harm dating back to Ferdinand's teenage years. The king had apparently spent decades attempting various forms of self-surgery, trying to modify his anatomy to make normal intimacy possible. These pathetic attempts had only made his condition worse, while adding layers of psychological trauma to his already impossible situation. The preserved organ, along with detailed medical drawings and written observations, was immediately sealed in the Vatican archives. Church officials deemed the material too disturbing and too politically sensitive for public knowledge, creating one of history's most bizarre state secrets. Even the Pope's own physicians were horrified by what they witnessed. Scholars who have been granted access to these materials centuries later describe them as simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling, a window into the private hell of absolute power corrupted by anatomical fate. The Vatican's secret archives contain the most grotesque evidence of how genetic lottery can destroy empires. Ferdinand's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on in the fractured Spain he left behind. Isabella II, the daughter who may or may not have been his biological child, inherited a kingdom torn apart by civil war, economic collapse, and international humiliation that would take generations to heal. The Spanish Empire, that had once dominated the world, was reduced to a minor European power, its decline accelerated by decades of misrule, by a king whose personal obsessions had taken precedence over public duty. Ferdinand's intimate failures had echoed across continents, destroying not just his wives, but an entire civilization's future. The human cost was staggering. 3 wives dead before age 30, their lives consumed by sexual trauma and psychological terror. Maria Antonia at 21, Maria Isabel at 21, Maria Joseph at 29, all sacrificed on the altar of Ferdinand's anatomical curse and political ambition. His terrorized subjects, the ruined kingdom, the lost empire, all had paid the price for a genetic lottery that went wrong centuries before any of them were born. Ferdinand's story reveals the human cost of absolute monarchy, where the personal problems of one man determined the fate of millions. Ferdinand was both perpetrator and victim of a system that concentrated too much power in the hands of individuals, fundamentally unprepared to wield it. European diplomatic correspondence from his era reveals courts across the continent studying the Spanish situation as a cautionary tale of personal dysfunction becoming national disaster. Modern historians, finally gaining access to long-sealed records, have uncovered the full scope of the Spanish royal family's genetic nightmare. The Habsburg and Bourbon intermarrying had created not just physical deformities, but psychological instabilities that manifested in the most intimate and destructive ways possible. Medical experts analyzing Ferdinand's condition through modern understanding suggest he suffered from a rare hormonal disorder that caused continued anatomical growth throughout adulthood. Whatever the scientific explanation, the practical implications destroyed not just his marriages, but the stability of an entire empire. Even Ferdinand's craftsmen became victims of his paranoia. Several artisans who worked on creating his specialized marital equipment were later found dead under mysterious circumstances, leading to rumors that Ferdinand had them, eliminated to prevent any possibility of revealing the true nature of their work. During Napoleon's invasion, French intelligence had extensive files on Ferdinand's condition. Foreign powers recognized that the Spanish king's sexual dysfunction was a political weakness that could be exploited. Royal intimate failure had become a matter of international military strategy. Ferdinand's 6 years of captivity at French chateaux were marked by continued medical experimentation. French physicians, freed from the constraints of royal protocol, conducted examinations and treatments that bordered on torture in their thoroughness, viewing the Spanish king as a fascinating medical specimen. During his exile, Ferdinand spent years writing to European royalty, seeking potential brides willing to accept his special circumstances. These letters reveal a man completely disconnected from his people's suffering, obsessed entirely with his own intimate problems while Spain burned under foreign occupation. The tragic irony was profound. Brave Spanish patriots died in muddy trenches and mountain passes to restore a king whose primary concern was finding new ways to manage his sexual dysfunction. Heroes sacrificed everything for a man who viewed their struggles as merely inconvenient interruptions to his bedroom obsessions. When Ferdinand returned to Spain in 1814, the crowds were unlike anything Europe had ever seen. They threw flowers, wept with joy, and fell to their knees as his carriage passed. Children born during the war saw their first glimpse of the king. Their parents had died to restore, unaware of the nightmare their celebration would unleash. Ferdinand smiled and waved from his carriage, but his mind was already focused on more intimate concerns. His first priority wasn't governing Spain or rewarding those who had fought for his restoration. It was finding a new wife who could finally give him the heir that had eluded him for so long. Ferdinand's first act as restored king was commissioning an entirely new set of marital aids from the finest craftsmen in Europe. He sent agents to Germany, Italy, and even the Ottoman Empire, seeking artisans who specialized in creating devices for delicate royal circumstances. The restoration had become a sexual shopping expedition. The resulting collection, hidden away in secret chambers of the palace, represented the finest achievement of perverted ingenuity that the early 19th century could produce. Ferdinand's bedroom had become a laboratory of sexual experimentation that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and dignity. Ferdinand had learned to see other people not as individuals with feelings and needs, but as tools to be used for his pleasure or obstacles to be eliminated. His wives were tools that failed to function properly. His subjects were tools for maintaining power. Anyone who opposed him was an obstacle that needed to be destroyed. His interactions with palace staff revealed growing sadism. Ferdinand began testing the limits of his power by issuing increasingly arbitrary and cruel orders. Servants who accidentally glimpsed his naked form didn't just disappear. They often vanished entirely, while guards who failed to maintain absolute secrecy found themselves assigned to the most dangerous frontier postings. Ferdinand maintained detailed lists of suspected mockers, planning elaborate revenge scenarios that he would implement once he had the power to do so. His sexual insecurity had metastasized into a systematic philosophy of persecution that would define his entire approach to kingship. The Escorial Conspiracy of 1807 revealed Ferdinand's true character. When caught planning to overthrow his own father with Napoleon's help, Ferdinand immediately threw all his co-conspirators under the metaphorical carriage wheels. He provided detailed confessions, named every participant, and begged his parents for forgiveness while his allies faced imprisonment. This betrayal established a pattern that would define Ferdinand's entire reign. He would use people for his own purposes, then destroy them the moment it became convenient. His sexual dysfunction hadn't just deformed his body, it had corrupted his soul, making normal human loyalty and gratitude impossible. Ferdinand's legacy was a monument to destruction. 3 dead wives, a questionable daughter, terrorized subjects, and a ruined kingdom, all paying the price for a genetic lottery that went wrong centuries before any of them were born. The curse that began with royal inbreeding had consumed everything it touched, leaving behind only suffering and shame. Ferdinand's story serves as the ultimate cautionary tale about absolute power. When personal dysfunction meets unlimited authority, the results are catastrophic not just for the individual, but for entire civilizations. His anatomical curse became Spain's national nightmare, proving that monarchies are only as stable as the mental health of their rulers. Ferdinand wasn't unique. He was the inevitable result of centuries of European royal inbreeding. The Habsburg jaw, haemophilia in the British royal family, and countless other genetic disasters were the price paid for keeping power within aristocratic bloodlines. Royal marriage was never about love, it was about power, and the genetic consequences were horrific. Modern genetic analysis reveals the specific chromosomal disasters that created Ferdinand's condition. The combination of multiple recessive genes, expressed through generations of cousin marriages, created what geneticists call a perfect storm of anatomical dysfunction. Science can now explain what seemed like divine curse to his contemporaries. Today, Ferdinand's private chambers remain largely unchanged, a macabre museum of sexual failure and royal madness. The portraits of his 3 dead wives still hang on the walls, while the bizarre medical contraptions he commissioned gather dust in hidden alcoves. It's a shrine to the destructive power of shame and unchecked authority. Modern historians and psychologists study Ferdinand's case as a perfect example of how personal trauma creates political tyranny. His sexual dysfunction didn't just affect his marriages, it shaped his entire worldview, turning a man who could have been merely inadequate into a monster who destroyed everything he touched. Ferdinand's toxic legacy poisoned Spanish politics for generations. The civil wars, political instability, and royal scandals that plagued 19th century Spain can all be traced back to the dysfunction he established. His damaged psyche became the template for Spanish monarchy, creating a cycle of incompetence that took centuries to break. Ferdinand's spectacular failure influenced constitutional development across Europe. Other monarchies, witnessing the Spanish disaster, began implementing limits on royal power, specifically to prevent personal dysfunction from becoming national catastrophe. Ferdinand's madness inadvertently advanced democratic governance. The human cost extends far beyond Ferdinand's 3 wives. Thousands of Spanish subjects died in revolutionary wars fought over royal succession, their lives sacrificed, because their king's anatomical deformity prevented him from producing a legitimate heir. Personal dysfunction had become a matter of national survival. Ferdinand's private correspondence reveals a man completely disconnected from normal human empathy. While his subjects starved and his kingdom crumbled, his letters focused obsessively on finding medical solutions to his sexual problems. The crown had become a vehicle for personal therapy rather than public service. Ferdinand's condition became an international scandal that affected European diplomacy for decades. Foreign ambassadors included detailed reports about the Spanish king's sexual failures in official correspondence, making royal intimacy a matter of state security and international relations. The handful of modern medical experts granted access to Ferdinand's preserved remains described the experience as profoundly disturbing. The 14-inch specimen, maintained in Vatican archives for nearly 2 centuries, represents the most extreme case of royal anatomical dysfunction ever documented. The Vatican's decision to maintain Ferdinand's medical secrecy reveals the continuing power of royal shame, even centuries after his death. Church officials argue that some historical truths are too disturbing for public knowledge, making Ferdinand's anatomy a permanent state secret protected by religious authority. Ferdinand's story raises disturbing questions about the relationship between physical anatomy and moral character. Did his sexual dysfunction inevitably create his political cruelty, or could he have channeled his personal suffering into empathy rather than tyranny? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature and power. Perhaps most unsettling is how Ferdinand's story demonstrates the role of genetic lottery in shaping historical destiny. A few recessive genes expressed through generations of royal inbreeding ultimately determined the fate of Spanish empire and millions of subjects across 3 continents. Today, Ferdinand rests in a massive marble sarcophagus, while his 3 wives lie in smaller graves nearby, a permanent reminder of how one man's sexual dysfunction destroyed multiple lives. The cemetery arrangement itself tells the story of royal power's deadly consequences. Some claim Ferdinand's ghost still haunts Spanish royal palaces, and in a sense, this is literally true. His toxic legacy continues to influence Spanish monarchy, creating patterns of dysfunction that persist even today. The trauma he inflicted on the institution of kingship itself has never fully healed. Ferdinand's story serves as the ultimate argument for constitutional democracy. When power is concentrated in the hands of individuals fundamentally unprepared to wield it, the results are catastrophic. Personal dysfunction becomes national disaster. When unchecked by democratic institutions and legal constraints, in the end, Ferdinand achieved a perverse form of immortality. His preserved anatomy serves as the most intimate form of historical evidence ever. maintained physical proof that personal shame and political power form a toxic combination that destroys everything it touches. Today, thousands of tourists visit Spanish royal sites, unaware of the sexual horrors that occurred within those ornate walls. The official histories mention Ferdinand's political failures, but carefully omit the intimate dysfunction that drove them. Some truths remain too disturbing for tourist brochures. Ferdinand remains history's most complex royal monster, simultaneously perpetrator and victim, destroyer and destroyed. His anatomical curse was not his fault, but his response to it was. The tragedy lies in how personal suffering, instead of creating empathy, generated only more suffering for others. Modern psychology recognizes Ferdinand's pattern, how victims of trauma often become perpetrators themselves, creating cycles of abuse that span generations. His sexual trauma didn't excuse his cruelty, but it explains the mechanism by which personal pain becomes political tyranny. The final irony of Ferdinand's story is that he ultimately succeeded in his quest for succession by accepting what he knew was another man's child. His greatest political success, securing the Spanish throne for Isabella II, was achieved through embracing the very sexual failure that had tormented him throughout life. The silk sheets that had once covered Ferdinand's deformed body became a metaphor for the Spanish kingdom he left behind, equally damaged, equally unable to function as nature intended. The nation had become a reflection of its ruler's dysfunction, requiring generations of therapy to heal. Ferdinand VII's preserved anatomy sits in Vatican archives to this day, an eternal monument to the destructive power of shame, the corruption of unchecked authority, and the tragic waste of human potential. The most perverted king in history achieved immortality, but as a cautionary tale about how intimate failure can echo through centuries, destroying not just individuals but entire civilizations. His anatomical legacy serves as history's most disturbing reminder that some secrets are too human for legend to embrace, too tragic for time to heal. If this dark journey through royal history fascinated and horrified you, smash that like button and subscribe to Nightmare Historians for more forbidden historical truths. Comment below which aspect of Ferdinand's story shocked you most, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Until next time, remember, the darkest chapters of history are often the ones they try hardest to hide.